Famous song of the Trịnh Công Sơn, a great composer of Vietnam. Cheer me up now.
Do you need a backup with YouTube or something?
Backup? Oh yeah. 1, 2, 3. Thank you. Mưa vẫn mưa bay trên tầng tháp cổ, dài té mấy thoa mắt xanh xao. Nghe lá thu mưa rơi mòn gót nhỏ, đường dài hun hút cho mắt thêm sâu. Mưa vẫn hay mưa trên tầng lá đổ, buổi chiều ngồi ngóng những chuyến mưa qua. Trên bước chân em âm thầm lá đổ, chợt hồn xanh buốt cho mình xót xa. Chiều nay còn mưa sao em không lại, nhớ mãi trong cơn đau vùi. Làm sao có nhau hằng lên nỗi đau, bữa tranh em xinh về màu. Mưa vẫn hay mưa trên tầng lá đổ, làm sao em bước những vết chim gì. Xin vẫn hay mưa qua miền đất đỏ, ngày sau xuôi đá cũng cần có nhau. Welcome. This is a song for you.
Yeah.
There, I know, please not. There is one little more announcement regarding your reports because some questions came up. So basically on your handout you have the major tasks, which is for basically the summer school sessions. There are 4 main points that you should address in your reports, which is your major learning outcomes of this day basically, your insights concerning transdisciplinarity, and also the links of the certain topic that was the topic of the day to transdisciplinarity. Also the relevance for your own work or your own studies. And also very important, some kind of reflection with regards to challenges or open questions. The report should be around 3 to 4 pages because it will also include 3 to 4 pictures. So it's not that extensive, but still you should try to address these 4 points as explicit as you can. For the field trip, it's basically the same report. There's only one little difference, which is that you're not only focusing on your insights concerning transdisciplinarity very generally, but specifically on your insights concerning transdisciplinary research. Yeah, are there any more questions regarding the reports? And there's also the group number 8. The report is a bit more open, of course, because you try to catch this atmosphere around the summer school. You also have some bullet points on your handout to guide you through this report, but your task is a bit more open than the other tasks, I guess.
Okay.
You can introduce.
Yes, I think. Yeah.
You're ready? You're ready? Good morning. Very warm welcome to the 3rd day of our summer school and field trips. I can see that you have good rest after the last 2 days of heavy schedule, and you will commence for another 2 days before we go to the fields. The speaker this morning, the lecturer of our first session of the day, is ready. He somehow forgot the thumb drive, so he had to go back to the hotel. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Dang Nguyen Ang. Professor Dang Nguyen An is the Vice President of VAS. VAS stands for Vietnam Academy of Social Science. And Dr. An is a leader of the Vietnamese partner of NOTS project. And he also co-convened the summer school and field trips in Hanoi last year. So it is our pleasure to ask him to come and join us to the second summer school. And he will give a 45 minutes lecture on the topic of climate change, migration, and inequality, a case of Vietnam. And he also have sent us the report that he and Professor Roy has completed. So, the floor is yours, and thank you for coming and give lecture to our participants this morning.
Thank you, Achan Chayan, and good morning, everyone. This is my pleasure to provide you with the information about our three main areas: migrations, environments, and inequality in one presentation. And I think that is very challenging because we cover a lot of broad issues. But I can try to address the issues first from the case of Vietnam. As Professor Chayan said, this is the second summer school of NOTS project. The first summer school took place in Hanoi, and by that time we didn't talk much about climate change or environment change. So we decided to include that issues today so we can have a broader understanding about the issues. My 45 minutes lectures will focus on certain concepts and typologies, something like frameworks to understand the linkage between migration, climate change, and inequality. And then I can introduce some findings of our study in Vietnam and with some policy suggestions. So I hope I can manage within 45 minutes. Many of you understand migrations, but it's very complex phenomenon. Yesterday we talked about cross-border international refugees movements. But if you want to classify migration into different times, and this is not only one typology, okay? This is the one of the typology I use for this kind of presentations. We look at the voluntary and involuntary migrations. Voluntary migrations, easy to understand. We can see how people go to Hanoi or Bangkok, go to Ho Chi Minh City, go to Chiang Mai to work for economic factors. The driver of this kind of migration, jobs, income, economic opportunities. And no one have to be forced to move. Some people have to move because of family, because of education. The students go to the city for education. It's a kind of migration. And I put them in the cultural and social migrations. But we want to talk about the involuntary or forced migrations. And there are many types of migration included in these areas. The one in red is what we are talking today, about environment migrants, climate-induced migrations. But additionally, we do also have refugees, we have displacement. Yesterday, Professor Chayan talked about that in Chiang Mai. And we also had to mention human trafficking. That also taking place largely in Southeast Asia. So this is one of the typologies. I said again, not talking about the comprehensive typologies. And also, it doesn't say much about internal or international. It can take place across the borders of the countries or inside the border of the countries. So what's next? I provide you the definitions of what we mean by environmental migrants. I think yesterday, Dr. Nuramon sent, I don't know, to all of us, or at least to me, by email about the presentations on international migrations. And she mentioned about this. Environmental migrants. And tomorrow morning, you can hear more about the presentation by the Southern Institute of Social Science. Basically, what they say here, it can be a person or group of persons. The reason to move is a sudden or gradual change in the environment. Yesterday, we heard what is environment yesterday. But I mean, mainly here is a natural environment. It's not much about the human-made environments. Because they are affected adversely by environment and climate change. So they have to change or relocate their residence. We say resident or habitual homes. Or it can be inside or outside the countries. It can be permanent or non-permanent movements. So at least it's very difficult to provide only one definitions, but this is the one I think that can be used. So what happened today in the world about the environment and climate-induced migration? So they are influenced by environment change as well as climate change. IOM said that today 20 million persons migrated by the extreme weathers. It's not with economic, not with social factors, but the climate or environment factor. And they predict by 2050, by the mid of this century, 25 million people displaced by sea level rising is one of the key aspects of climate change. The sea level keep growing up. And 1 billion migrants can be considered environment migrants by 2050. Why? Why we talk about this? Because the migration can reduce the risk for life, for livelihoods, and change the ecosystem. These are adaptation strategies. Is one way to cope with the negative impacts of environment and climate change. In many areas of the world, people move not because politically they are exploited or they are really like forced to move, but they move because they want to go to the better place to avoid the risk of disaster, of the change in the environment. You can see that in many examples. But if we look at the perspective of inequality, and mainly social inequality, it's not open to everyone to move. Migration is a coping strategy, but it's not possible for certain group of people not to move, like the poorest people, like the most vulnerable people to move. So it's not equally opportunity open to everyone. Because why? Migration depends on information, depends on resource you have, depends on your status, networks, personal and household factors. And also it varies by different factors of inequalities: age, genders, class, ethnicity, religions, income. People are not the same propensity to migrate. They are different. Basically, the better off, the rich, more likely to have a means to migrate. The poor without information, networks, contacts, they don't know where to go. They don't know where to relocate. They have no house except one house. In many countries, people have many houses, right? In summer, they stay in one place. In winter, they study in another place. In Vietnam, people in Hanoi have one house, and Ho Chi Minh City, they have another house to avoid the winters in Hanoi. But for the poor, they cannot do that. It's impossible. Or if you don't know anyone in the Ho Chi Minh City or in Chiang Mai, it's not easy to go and relocate in Chiang Mai because you don't have a relationship, you don't have information, social capital. So basically, if you look at the inequality, it's different by social groups. If you want to make a pictures or diagram, I can say that climate change takes place in the macro levels, affecting the living environments, and then affecting the people's life, livelihood, and decision to migrate. And if we want to do modeling, some people is very quantitative methodologies speaking. This is the way I mean. The climate change can affect migrations, but the factors. You can make modeling like that. So we can see how we can predict the probability to migrate as a dependent variables that are affected by many factors, of course, household, individual factors, but social inequality also affect and determines the relationships between the environment, change, and migrations. So it's a very complex issue if we want to measure the net effects of migrations, etc. And why we look at the relationships? Because when we talk about this, we talk mainly about the environment in the rural areas where a large population live and works, and rural community largely affected by weather, by climate event, floods, rainfalls, sea level rising, salinity, especially in South Vietnam. You can see in Mekong River Delta, sea level rising, salinity is key factors, and drought. So they have a very adverse impacts on the people's life, people's income, debts, health, and well-beings. And of course, not only that, they affect indirectly through the disease, through the bad crops, through the poor sanitations, and less quality waters. So it affects the people's health and life. And people may not want to move because it's not easy to migrate. This is the pictures in Vietnam in 1999, I remember. The heavy floodings. Of course, you can have many examples and pictures in many countries to see how the climate-related disaster forcing people to move. And where they go, they can have a choice or not. I don't think they have a choice. They have to find a place. They can stay short term or long term. They can go to the city for safety reasons as well as for the risk reductions. And that makes more pressures on the housings and the infrastructures in the city. A lot of slum and poor housings developed along the rivers in the city, and that affects the people a lot. Now the case of Vietnam. This is a story in general, but I want to show more about the case of Vietnam. If you look at the country background, it's a long shape. It's the land area and coastal line is very long compared to Thailand, right? We have a longer line of sea lines. You can see 3,000 kilometer. Population size also very big compared to Thailand. And we rank number 3 in Southeast Asia and 14 in the world about populations. How much population in Germany? 80 plus, so still smaller than 90 plus. Next year, no, I don't want to say 1 or 2, but vary by population size, and it affects the migration probability as well as affects the impacts of climate, where you live. Of course, Vietnam today have achieved the population, we say growth, in terms of we have a low fertility. It's only 2 children per woman, and the life expectancy is much better than before, 73 years. However, the percentage of urban areas is still low, about 35%. I'm sure much lower than Germany. And if you at the economy, you can see how people work, where they work. They work mainly in rural areas. Rice, coffee, or seafood, mainly the export products of Vietnam, but it's mainly produced by the farmers as well as in the countryside. We often proud of the growth rate of the economy, about 7% per year for many years. But at the same time, we also proud of the mobile smartphone users, because that's one of the indicators of development. And urban areas, 71% of population have smartphones. It's much higher than many countries compared to Laos or Myanmar. And rural areas, 68%. It's very high. That's why we are very connected. When connected, sorry to say, with the globes by social media. I think China is lower, much lower. And mobile phone has something to do with migration, right? If you want to contact the people in city, you don't have to go to the city. You just make a phone call easily, and you can find out a lot of job opportunity in the city. You can send the social workers or domestic workers from countryside easily. That's labor migrations. Or in the countryside, the city dweller can know from mobile phone or by internet easily. But we also have a lot of ethnic groups, and they are poor. They are much less economically developed, as well as they are isolated in the mountainous, where landslide, flooding, flash flood also take place. It's not safe areas at all. We talk about the mountainous area of Vietnam. So this is the background, and if we look at the country maps by different regions, geographical region or ecological regions, different regions have a different kind of disasters affecting them. For example, the green color, that is the Red River Delta and Hanoi city, is mainly storm and flooding. There's not much sea level rising because they don't have a sea. However, if we look at the red southern parts of Mekong Delta, flood, drought, storm, sea water risings, salt invasions or salinity, or in the central part of Vietnam, with forest fire, flash flood, and landslide. So it depends on where you live. It's very much vulnerable or not vulnerable to environment change. So the key feature or key note we have to remember is that Vietnam is the most vulnerable, one of the most vulnerable countries affected by climate change. As you see that they call Vietnam a hotspot, and only 5 countries in the world are most susceptible to climate change impacts, and Vietnam is one of the 5 countries. And sea level rising 1 meter, 22 million people will lose a house, and 40,000 hectares of land will be underwater, and the loss about 12% of GDP. So this is a really concerns if you look at like a Mekong deltas, the red color in the maps. You see that Laos has no sea, so we don't talk much about the sea level risings. Thailand have some sea, Cambodia also, but mainly Vietnam have to think about 80% of land area lower than sea level. So we have to be smart to be like a Holland with the river bank maybe, or sea level risings. This is the Mekong Delta. It's not only sea level rising, but also salinity. You cannot plant rice or raise a fish as you did before, because now the water is salty, because the seawater invade to the river system in Mekong Deltas. You can see that. Mekong Delta now is not much productive anymore, agriculture and also farming. But at the same time, we have problem in the Red River Deltas. It's a province of Hai Phong and Quảng Ninh. It also affecting, and also Nam Định, Thái Bình. It's not safe at all in terms of food security as well as residential safety. So what is the problems and the characteristics? We see the more and more frequency of floods, of typhoons, of landslide, of windstorm. And last week in Vietnam, 10 days ago in Vietnam, problem happening in Lai Châu, in Lao Cai province, 22 live deaths, and a lot of people injured. And today in Hanoi and in many provinces of Vietnam, heavily raining and affecting the people's life. But the poor regions are extremely affected because of infrastructure, because of housing, because the living condition is bad. It's not good. So they are extremely affected by landslide, by the fast floods, by storm, by raining, by fire, forest, etc. So we call natural disaster is a regional specific and affecting the migration in different ways. It's a big challenge to poverty reductions because the poor more likely to live in the mountainous areas, ethnic groups. And after each disaster, they become poor again. They get out of poverty and then become poor again, easily, after 1 or 2 disasters, especially in ethnic minorities groups. So I want to put one more slide on the natural disaster. It's different kind of disaster. You have to think about climate impacts. High, medium, low frequencies. The more or frequent disaster is fast flood, typhoon, rainfalls. And then we have a landslide, we have a drought, we have sun invasions. And Vietnam is the last earthquake and tsunami. But it will happen one day, I don't know. But you cannot say you are not vulnerable to tsunami. And if you talk to Vietnamese people, they will mention a lot about flooding today. It's happening really seriously because the country near the sea and a lot of storms and hurricanes come from the Philippines, come from the Pacific Ocean, hit Vietnam easily. And the picture showing you that it's normal in central part of Vietnam. It's happened like this every year. It's underwater, the house, people, the children affected a lot, and isolated areas. After 10 or 20 days of flooding, we have no rescue, not easy rescue or supply of necessaries for the people. Last week in Lai Châu, landslide, and also when landslide take place, after that you don't see any house, it's underground easily. Maybe a village, a hamlet can disappear after the landslide and no rescue. It's too late because overnight. It's very horrible. And we calculate the economic loss. This is a one-up study by ADB, not by my institute. And they say that the cost is not easy to calculate. It depends on the disaster. Some year it's low because disaster didn't take place. But some other, and recently, it's much more. So it's a big loss, and it's not easy to handle by the economy itself. It has to be shared by different stakeholders, even NGO, international donors, as well as by the people themselves. This is the poverty rate. I think I'm going to show you the near poor populations, which is line. You can see that most people are near poor, and if the disaster happens, they become poor easily, as I said. So this is distributions of the poor and the near poor, and it's easy to fall into poverty by the data is coming from the living standard surveys. So I have to say that it's not easy to address the issue of poverty and inequality when we talk about the disaster. Sorry, this is Vietnamese, but it's mainly about the understanding of policy support between the poor and the non-poor. We did a study last year in Hòa Bình, and the yellow are the poor and the blue are the non-poor. So the first one is don't know the policy. I think the poor do not know much more than the non-poor in terms of proportions. And then we have information, we have about the policy, about tax, about jobs, about training, vocational training, about the education, medical care, as well as land and housing. So basically, I think the poor have a more disadvantage in terms of information, in terms of social service, in terms of understanding of policies. So that shows the inequalities in the pictures. This is the area most affected by environment change and disaster. And you can see that if things happen, who are more survivors, who are less, who are more successful relocated, who are less possible to migrate. So we have to look at the poor, and we talk about inequality and climate change and migrations, because they are less likely to move. They are less likely to protect themselves compared to the better off. So the poor are hit hardest. If you are poor, you are vulnerable, but also you don't have things to protect yourselves. And they have done very little or limit to contribute to climate change. They don't have a car, they don't have a big house with aircon to contribute to the gas emissions. They don't consume a lot of electricity, but they are hit hardest. And they live in prone disaster areas. As I said, poor regions, mountainous areas, and work in the sector sensitive to climate change, like the fisheries. And the government can evacuate them if things happen. Before the hurricane or storm came to Vietnam, the government announced the policy that everyone had to go back offshore, have to go back. You have to fishery, and people in the mountain and near to the forest have to go down to the lowlands, etc. But that's people, not property. The house, the cattle, the furnitures, all in the same place, and they can be lost Only the people can survive if things happen. So they lost, and they do not have livelihoods. They lots of livelihoods, they lots of food securities, and especially broken ties of the families because the debts of the family members. The parents, the husband, the wives are main income earners. And if they die, what happened to the family and children? And it happened to many cases now. So we have to look at, especially at that kind of groups. And I hope if you go to the field, if you happen to ask the poor about how do you think about environments and how the environment impacts on them or disaster effects, I think they can tell you some stories. And someone can ask me, what is the social protection for them? Why the state? Why the NGOs? Why the business sector do not do anything, or they do something? I think if you talk about social protections, the inequality become more clear. The poor household have a least access to the public service. The migrant also access less to social services, education, resource information. And current policy in Vietnam as well as in many countries in Southeast Asia may not work well for the poor people. But the better off, the rich group can have a better positions. They can have a better health service, better school, better food, better housing compared to the most vulnerable groups. And I show you the social protection coverage of Vietnam compared to other countries. And the questions, it's only limit now. You reach a ceiling, cannot provide more social protections for the different groups. So the question is how you can manage with the climate change impacts. Vietnam is not too bad, but we are in the middle groups, like China, like India. But compared to Japan, to Korea, to Mongolia, etc., the social protection expenditures is lower compared with the GDP. So it's not a better groups, it is in the middle groups. And the answer is very difficult. If disaster happen more frequent, if climate change impacts more severe, the social protection may not work. So what do we need about policy response? I have only a few more slides in 45 minutes. Policy response, you can talk in macro level or micro level, or both macro and micros. But we have to accept the fact that the climate change will be more intensified and have impacts, affecting the life of the people, and make people migrate because they cannot live in the sea level rising, so we cannot live in the usual place of residence. Vietnam today, in terms of policy, more likely to look for the adaptations measures. You got to adapt to the climate rather than to cope to strong fighting against the climate, because it's not easy to fight the climate. So it's only adaptation or mitigations could be the measures. But we need to have a policy that we can minimize the impact in the effective and equitable ways. I have to say again, underline the effective and equitable ways. Because the resource is limited and it must be used effectively, not wasting the resource, not losing the money, and equitably across the groups. It's not only the better off, the easy people to reach, but also hard to reach people in the remote areas. And This is a picture or the diagram. I think that international donor today use. They want to build the resilience community by different aspects. Early warning system, risk mapping. We can talk about the vulnerable mapping, but one of the factor or one of the measure is the migration and relocations. You can see that. So migration is in pictures, in these pictures. In different policy, different ways to cope with environment and climate change. So you can have a village and the community more resilient. It's not fighting against the God. You have to adapt. It's much more easier to say that. And I stop here because the time is up now. But I have to say that, I mean, we have a lot of discussions about these areas. It's not new, but it's come to the front of the discussion today when we talk about migrations. We talk about inequalities. We cannot put them away from the environmental and climate change impacts. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a more questions, and we can have some Q&A, or I don't know what time we can stop. But I would like to hear more feedbacks from the.
Thank you very much. I think there's more than enough time for a Q&A session. So I just invite you to raise your questions, add comments, and so on. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor An.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yes. No. I get the pen. So.
Okay.
Please. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's quite interesting that you chose this topic that we actually discussed about among a few students just a few days ago as well.
Uh-huh.
And one thing that we were talking about was that this dichotomy between economic migration as voluntary and climate change migration as forced migration is very simplifying in many ways. Yes, you also said it's just one model, but I think can be challenged quite a lot.
Yes.
Because it's such an artificial division, and you also mentioned in your presentation that climate change effects had a lot of economic losses as a consequence. And I think you can argue very much for saying that climate change effects can have economic consequences for a lot of people that then also lead to migration. So I think there's a lot of interconnectedness that in such a model just aren't really considered so much. So when you think of saline intrusion, you mentioned change rainfall patterns, soil degradation, or the loss of fish, or you name it, that has economic consequences as well. So yeah, maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. This is a new areas of research, so I don't think we can agree in typologies or modelings. When I say that this is only one, only one typologies to classify migrations. I don't mean that we can make it clear black or white between voluntary or involuntary. You cannot make it black or white, but at least as the tools for operationalize your variables, you have to identify the question like why do you move? The question is you are mover, you are migrant, but why? Why you decided to move? And the main reason they can say, oh, I want a better jobs, or maybe, oh, I am not happy to move. I was asked to move. So that's involuntary or voluntary. In that, by that movement of that decisions, people can change the mindset after migrations. Before migration, they say, oh, that's economic. And then they arrive in the new place, they say, oh, not happy with the job, so not economic. This is more to do with the political. So this is typologies, okay? This is not like talking about the timeline migrations. But at least we can say that people are voluntary or not voluntary to move at that time and place. And if climate change or disaster happen to Chiang Mai or Hanoi, and no one want to move, but we have to move because of flooding, because of landslide, and that we call involuntary or forced migrations. Now, for the modeling, I said that, for the modeling, I said that this is a simplify the relationships. Sorry, 1 minute. Simplify the relationship. For example, I say that, it's different from my laptop. Sorry, yeah. You say that is very simple. I said, yes, very simple. We don't see any household or family or individual factors in here. But if we talk about three things, climate change, migration, and equality, I think we want to see, we want to do the research to see how the impact of climate change on migration and vary by certain group, poor or non-poor. The direction of arrow can be different ways. But in the past, they didn't look at the social inequality. The IOM just looked at the climate change and migrations. But our projects want to look more on social inequalities, how the outcome are different for different social group, age group, gender group, ethnicity, as I said, the king people or the non-king people in Vietnam. So it's just ideas. It's not like sophisticated model for our data analysis. I have some question from Chris.
Yeah, it's not a question, but it's directly related to that. I think I would not take your command, your remark as saying an argument against typologies or analytic divisions at all, but we should care about or ask ourselves what is the basis of the data, and they might be totally different. It's a difference whether you accumulate the factual movements of people and you make a large-scale data about that, and then you relate it to certain factors which you also can get by quantitative information. That would be one data source. And a completely other data source, if you go to, for example, individuals or probably better households, and ask these people what is their motives? What are their motives for moving? And another level, even on the household level, if you observe these people in their behavior, you might get out some non-stated motives. So that's even another plane. And so you have different data resources. For example, what I find as an anthropologist especially interesting is what is called natural decision-making studies about people. So you don't get out their decision-making from their factual behavior, but in an accumulative way from hundreds of people, but you take part in their individual moves and ask them before the move, during the move, and after the move, and often what they say before the move and after the move, after the moving or migrating, is different. Because people are rationalizing the behavior as everyone does in everyday decisions. So you get a multi-layered view of that. And I can give you one example. For example, you told about people not moving. And you said often the people not moving are simply too poor. Or, for example, don't move because they lack some information, for example, about potential places to move to. But if you see comparatively the results of these natural decision-making studies, what came out that the stayers often are not only poor, or as in sometimes in Vietnam is said, less educated people, or probably a little bit not so quick in decision making, but often the staying is a result of a rational decision, because they have some options at the place and don't move because of that. So the stayers are not only the left behind or inactive people and so on. And these aspects you can only get out if you make a micro-oriented research.
because,
So my plaidoyer was for combining these different researches, but combining doesn't mean okay, we put all into one real, one big data box, and then we add them all only. Yeah.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank
Gaman.
you, Chris. Yeah, that's a
Gaman.
good comment. Because today we don't talk much about methodologies. Yesterday too, because we know this is a training on transdisciplinary methods or approach or perspective, but we just focus on the issue first. And I think that in our study, it is not only the sampling surveys, we also follow the people closely before the move, after the move. They move to the new place. We also have a study at the new place where they live. But 75% of the mover, of the migrants in the new place, happy or satisfied with the decision to move. And that is very good figures. Even we cannot combine individual easily in the decision of migration in that way. But when we ask about the outcome, are you satisfied or are you happy with the decision to move and live here? 75% say yes. Of course, we can see that they can change their mind or they can be affected by many factors at different levels or layers. But at the end, you can get some quantified data about the outcome of the move or of decision to move. For the stayer, for the non-mover or non-migrants, yes, you can see that they can have a choice. They can stay or they can migrate. But recently, because the disaster happened so quickly, if they stay in the prone areas, in the disaster-prone areas, they lie at risk. And in Lai Châu province, just 10 days ago, those who died was a non-mover because they think that they can be safe. They think that thing happened not to them, but to others. And they want to keep the house and property in their hand. So they said they didn't go. But most people left the areas because the warning, the early warning system. And among the 20 dead people from the about 16 families, they are non-movers. So that makes people also very much affected or not affected by the decision to move. If they do not want to move, they can stay. But we recommend in terms of policy, or we say motivate. In Vietnamese, we say vận động. In Vietnamese, motivate the people to move. Because that's a very bad areas in terms of risky and frequent areas for disaster. It's very complicated, and I hope we can introduce more methodologies and different techniques to collect the data and to observe, to interview, in-depth interview, or to participate to understand the people's decisions. But I can leave it for tomorrow's sections, because tomorrow we have methodology sections. For inequality, I think this afternoon we can have a full afternoon for these issues. So for me, inequality is a poor or non-poor first. and sometimes economic inequality. We have to look for broader of equality in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of age, in terms of religions, ethnicity, not only income. But that's too broad, as I said that, so we can start from simple. Yes.
There is one more question I just want to highlight here, that if you bring up the point of intersectionality, I think that's also something which might be interesting for some of your field studies and field trips. Hannah?
Please, we have it.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation. My question is, like the action against climate change? And is there some collaboration in the region, or maybe in other Asian countries like Bangladesh, they have like similar problems like what you told us about Vietnam? And the other question is, like when there is a political working collaboration, is there also, or can there be a collaboration between scientists or academics in this field of research, like how climate change and migration is connected?
Yes, it should be interdiscipline. I don't say transdiscipline, but it should be interdiscipline research, because we don't know little about nature and disaster and environment. We are sociologists, so we are looking more on the migration and inequality. But the team should have, and actually my research on this include more people from other institutions and backgrounds. It's not only sociologists or economists. And we also want to invite the people affected by the disaster in the study, so that we can have a more insight and also more profound knowledge of the people when we do the study. In terms of international cooperations against climate change, I think so far my personal understanding is very limited, because superpower China, Russia, US, European countries sometimes, are not in agreements to cut down the gas emissions. They also blame each other on the mitigating the migration, the climate change impacts. But for Vietnam, for example, we also have a certain new initiative to reduce the dischargements of gas emissions. For example, we have projects on the green building, green city, green agriculture. Agriculture produces a lot of carbonates emissions. And also we have a smart city, and also certain projects level, and green consumption, spend less on the plastic bottle, something like this. In Hanoi now, some workshops they ban this because that's plastic. They only accept the glass of water. That's, small example to say that people have to change the mindset, change the understanding and perceptions, because from the small behavior you can contribute to reduce the impact of climate change in terms of temperature rising, etc. So maybe we have to go to Bangladesh and see how they deal with sea level risings, because that's also very good countries to do that. But again, the context is very important. I have to say that many countries agree in principle that we have to adapt to climate change, but the different countries have a different ways to deal with, and less collaborate, I have to say that. Paris agreements, COP1, COP2, very slow, I don't say that. And the big countries do not pay for the cost. So I don't think that's easy. Oh, please, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Ang. I have a question on, you briefly mentioned those issues of social protection, socially inclusive agendas, more just distributions of resources and things like that. Can you be a little bit more specific of how that could look like, for example? Like,
Yeah.
what can we imagine when you talk about this?
I said social inclusions in Vietnam is in the ceiling now. It's a limitation. We cannot spend more in terms of percentage of GDP. It's now, you can look at this, it's about nearly 4% of GDP is spent for social protections, right? It's about nearly 5%, but it can be 4%. And for the not a high-income country like Vietnam, that's a lot of things. But they spend on many things. The problem that's not only on these areas. They spend on education, they spend on education, labor, they spend on health insurance and social assistance. So very diverse and not effective in some way. Because you have $100, but you spend too many things. It doesn't change your life. You have to focus. At least $50 for one thing you want to make it change. That's what I mean. So it's not effective. But in terms of social inequalities also, the poor get less. For example, in the big hospital, modern hospital, who has a user of hand service, the better off. The poorest may not be able to go to the province hospital. They stop at district hospital and commune hospital. They get less because that is a place where the equipment is not modern. The facility is not good. The doctor quality is not good. All investment in the medical system in Vietnam is in the top level. The doctor is good in the city, you know that. Same in Chiang Mai. So the poor cannot get the service. Even if you spend more social protection fund for that. So disproportionate. So I mean that we have to look at more inclusive. Inclusive is not leaving anyone behind. No one left behind, right? Like the SDGs, they say that. Sustainable Development Goals say that. So I hope in the same impacts of disaster, of the climate change, the poor are not left behind in terms of social protection as well as initiatives to overcome the problems. But that is a long story. I cannot bring in these presentations. Yeah. Yes?
Any other question?
Do we have a group discussion on this? No, right?
A group discussion is in the evening session.
Oh, evening section.
Or afternoon session.
Okay, yeah.
If not, as we have 5 more minutes till the coffee break, I would like to raise one, or as we could see that there is a lot of expertise and a lot of data there and so on, and also your colleagues from CIS presented last time a very big study on the household and the effects by climate change itself. And you just mentioned you don't want to be the poor left behind, so to say. So I wonder, as we are in a summer school for transdisciplinary research, I wonder how or what is lacking then. So I don't mean now that what is lacking to save the world and to diminish climate change or stop climate change totally. So also again maybe on the micro level and in terms of research and transdisciplinary research, what would you need or what do you need? Or maybe it's also it could be also a very unrealistic idea or a utopian one, how such a transdisciplinary research could or should look like. Maybe you can add a little bit on that, or also your ideas or dreams maybe, and so to say.
I think, I cannot answer that. This is a very difficult questions, but I think we have to put hands together. Because all we learn from this kind of workshop or discuss about the presenter must be informed to the society, to the policy maker as well as the people. Otherwise, you never know this. What can happen to this? So I hope in the next year we have to do some more activity, not only the dissemination workshop, but more than that, to media, to the mass, to the people as well as to public policies makers about what we find and how can we use the transdisciplinary to inform more and more insight findings of this kind of issue. That's very complicated and also very important as you define in the beginning of the project. migration inequality and environment change is a big issue today. So this is the second year of the project now. I don't think we can go very far. 2 more years or 1 more year? I don't know. But I do hope, my advice is to bring out more results and findings from our study. Even not empirical study, even this is more like a class-based study to the VAS.
You mean more of how transdisciplinary research could look like in these topics and fields
Yes.
of research, and what
And how it's more effective than conventional research,
why it's
for example.
the positive effects, basically.
But it's very tough to do that. We have to make efforts. So thank you.
Thank
for
you.
spending time this morning, and let's have the breaks. Okay.
Let's go for coffee.